Thank you. Okay, I'm very pleased to be here with you, and I'm always pleased to talk about Martin Luther King. And before I get into, by the way, what I'm going to do is make some comments and then invite some questions. And I hope that I can address them. And before I start my comments, I just want to mention that it so happens that today is the beginning of a series that's appearing on YouTube from the 6th floor museum at Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. I was one of many people interviewed by them about things surrounding JFK. This museum is dedicated to President Kennedy. And so I was one of many people who were interviewed about President Kennedy, the 60s, and for me, most particularly Martin Luther King. And they're starting a series today that extends from today through February, dealing with Martin Luther King and Black History Month, having some of us old folks talk about things from back then. And we did that individually. So, and I'm honored to be the person that they started off with today. So if you're interested later on, you can check it out. And I'll warn you, you might just want to look a little while. The interview with me is 93 minutes. Okay, so it goes over a lot about me and a lot about the 60s and a lot about King and several other things. And so anyway, I invite you to check that out if you're interested. I think the place for me to start my comments is about what Martin Luther King used to say early on. And that was, we have to remove the signs and symbols of our inferiority and then move into mainstream American society. Now, what he meant by those symbols was those symbols that said no blacks here, no Greek, no Negroes here, and the harsh segregation of things, the back of the bus kinds of things, the we don't hire Negroes kind of thing, and so on and on and on. So we got to remove those symbols of our inferiority, and then we will move into society. So I say that because many people are confused about what Martin Luther King was and what he did. They assume that he first was just, in fact, totally was just concerned about integration and integrating society and desegregating society so that blacks could enter into mainstream America. And that later on, he began to think about other things like economics and so on. So that's why I start with that he always talked about the need to deal with economic issues. And while I'm thinking about it, I'll call your attention to the March on Washington in 1963. And think about the pictures you see often of the men, mostly men, standing around the podium around Martin Luther King. You remember they had on these white paper hats. Those were Union people. And some people forget that the name of the event that was the March on Washington was for jobs and freedom. So the first thing was jobs and freedom was second. I'll also go further and say that considering the March on Washington, I'm one of those who, through the years, regretted that he ended his speech the way he did. Now, most people loved the way he ended his speech. I thought it was outstanding and interesting. But when he talked about, when he had this ad lib portion, which was the end of his speech, which was about his dream. And he had been admonished, admonished might be too strong a word, but a couple of his lieutenants and associates had asked him not to include that. And since it wasn't in his written remarks, you might wonder, well, why would they ask him to exclude it? Well, there had been a march in Detroit 2 months earlier, similar to the one that we planned for Washington. And this march in Detroit, King gave a much longer speech that ended with this "I have a dream" part. And so several people close to him were aware that he had begun to use that occasionally, that "I have a dream" part. And they argued, oh, by the way, I should mention that this march in Detroit was led by Reverend C.L. Franklin. That Reverend C.L. Franklin was the father of Aretha Franklin. Okay, Reverend C.L. Franklin was an important person in the whole history of African-American culture. And when I was a kid growing up, this is gratuitous here, I just have to mention it. When I was growing up, there were two types of Black Baptist preachers. Those who tried to imitate C.L. Franklin, who was considered the best, the top, and those who tried to demonstrate that they were not trying to imitate C.L. Franklin. In fact, C.L. Franklin was reported to be Martin Luther King's favorite preacher. Now, they were two different types of preachers, but C.L. Franklin was what we call a hooper. He would lay out his argument early on and move along, and then he would get into the kind of shouting part. But always his sermons were things well put together and meaningful. So anyway, back to the March on Washington. King's followers, not followers, but the people who were around him, had asked him not to do that speech. And the reason I'm mentioning that now is that I think it makes people forget what the whole speech and what the March on Washington was all about. And they had asked him not to do that because they said the speech was not kind of synchronous with the argument of the march. And so I want you to think about this now and later, that King's main discussion there was that the country needed to remove all these shackles and obstacles to Black America and others. And he said that those who thought that we had come to DC just to kind of blow off a little steam were in for a rude awakening, because there would be, if there is no justice, there would be no peace. Now, he didn't say that, I don't think, in that speech, but he said it often, and that's where the expression comes from: no justice, no peace. So basically, he was arguing for jobs and freedom. Okay. Later on, well, actually, even during this time, he used to almost crack a joke about it. He said, we are here fighting to integrate restaurants, and we can't afford to go to them. We have to change that as well. We need to have the economic wherewithal to go to these restaurants that we are integrating. There were two kind of major things happening in 1967, 1968 that led up to Martin Luther King's assassination. Okay. And rather than just talk about King's, which is my main subject here, his Poor People's Campaign, I want to talk about another thing that's happening. In the 1967, we had two major riots in the so-called Black ghettos. The first one in Newark, that was a big one. We had had riots all through the years, every year across the country. But Newark was a big one. And then a few weeks later, there was one in Detroit that was even bigger. Detroit was a big riot, and I'm sure you know about it. And President Johnson assigned a commission, appointed a commission to look into this march. I mean, not march, this riot. And he said he wanted them to answer three questions. Number one, what happened? Number two, why did it happen? And number three, what can we do to keep it from happening again? Well, this commission was appointed in the summer of 1967, and many of us just poo-pawed it because we thought that they would be a great whitewashing of the situation, but they fooled us. On March 1st, they came out with a report. I hope you have heard of it, and I hope you've seen the report. It's called the Kerner Commission Report. It was published in a small paperback in the beginning by Bantam Books, and it sold 2 or 3 million copies right away. It was a big, big deal. The Kerner Commission Report. And so they came out with this on March 1st, 1968. And they said, what happened? Well, many people were really disrespecting Black America by saying, what is this a communist thing? Are the communists taking over and leading these kind of riots? And the commission said, no, these were reactions to the pressure cooker that Blacks were being put in the ghettos in this country. Okay. And I'm summarizing these hundreds of pages that they wrote by saying, number two, they said, well, why did it happen? They said the reason it happened was white racism. Now, this is one of the reasons I'm mentioning this. Oh, by the way, for me, this book, the Kerner Commission Report, I consider the most important book written in my lifetime. Okay. And I'm one of the people who kind of poo-pawed the commission because it was made up of establishment people. The chair was the sitting governor of Illinois. The vice chair was the Republican mayor of New York City. And so we could go on and on and on. But they said that it was white racism. This had never been stated in America, ever. So by any, big national body, any national committee or commission or something at that level of a presidential commission, that never been such a statement as that this was white racism. So that was kind of new. And as a result, that's why the book was so popular. It was front page news. The report was front page news all across the country. Okay. I worked for IBM at the time. And actually, one of our sales meetings, the subject was the Kerner Commission report. It was that big a deal because it just spoke the truth. And the reason, and the second reason I'm mentioning this is that the third item, the third question from the president was, what can we do to keep it from happening again? And they came out with a prescription. They said, well, there are three options we have. One, we can do nothing, and that's unconscionable. Number two, we can go in and work in the ghetto and improve the ghetto. That would be a good thing, but it would be totally insufficient.
He had no evidence. He worked at Wendy's. Wow.
Okay. And the third thing is what we advocate. And what I'm going to do is summarize the several chapters of that book by saying they argue that we should integrate this country. We should integrate society. We should integrate our cities. Now, what they meant by that was that we should stop building highways through our ghettos. We should stop moving businesses way away from the cities. And we should start, if we had them way away, we should have transportation between the cities and these suburban and ex-urban areas that we had these factories in, and so on. And they went on with the long prescription of what we should do. And we were about to have this long discussion. It begun, as I said, across the country about these issues. Wow, white racism. Wow, we need to do A, B, and C. Now, the other thing that was happening during this time was Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. Okay, many people are aware that Martin Luther King was assassinated in Memphis, where he was there working with the garbage workers in their strike. And they would therefore think this was his main thing. This was a side issue. Martin Luther King had many side issues, but this was one. The Poor People's Campaign was his main issue. In fact, he was working 20-hour days to drum up business to go there. I kind of know this because I saw Martin Luther King 3 times during the month before he was assassinated. And the reasons for that is the two first, on the first meeting at his church in Atlanta, I'd asked him for a meeting. So he agreed to meet with him, and I told him the name, the place, and time. There were some things I needed to discuss with him. And the other was my work with others and following his request is that we all come to DC, that we occupy DC, and that we even move to close it down if necessary, until the country decided to do something about this poverty, that it was a shame to have the poverty rate that we had in the wealthiest country in the world, that we had this kind of poverty. To give you a sense of it, the childhood poverty at the time he was assassinated was 15.6% of all youth. Well, right now in 2020, it's 16.1. And in the interim, it has gotten as high as over 20%. So we've done some things to improve it, but not enough. And in an aside, I would just say the Build Back Better plan would reduce the poverty rate to much, much lower. For example, the poverty rate for Blacks would go from over 20% as it is now to down to 13%. So what the Build Back Better plan will do is it would move in conjunction, which is already started with the rescue plan by the child tax credit issue, that if the Build Back Better plan should pass, then it would make the total decrease in poverty over the last year 40%. So in other words, this would carry out what Martin Luther King gave his life for. So let's go back. This was totally economic. He said, we're not going to leave Washington until there is a plan, an economic plan to relieve this poverty that we have, because it's unconscionable. So, okay. Now, these two things are related: the Kerner Commission report and the Poor People's Campaign. Somehow they could have been closer related, but I'm relating them in a negative sense. Nothing was done with the Kerner Commission report. These prescriptions they laid out were ignored. They were being discussed in that month. And the primary reason I argue why they were ignored is that on April 4th, just a little over a month after it came out, Martin Luther King was assassinated. And that's when the country began to change even more. Then the issue wasn't how can we eliminate this racism and how can we build better communities and not have these kinds of things go on in our cities. The issue became, because what happened when Martin Luther King was killed was just hundreds of riots across the country, okay? And so the definition became, we got to stop these violent people. The issue is violence. Richard Nixon in 1968 ran on a law and order platform based upon the demonstrations associated with things like the Poor People's Campaign, which never got that big because when King was killed, our effort kind of got much smaller. However, there was also the riot at the Democratic National Convention. I hope many of you remember that. So all of these things were interpreted as the society going to hell and we got to be stricter with our law enforcement. And that's when the militarization of the police force started. So I'll end my comments with you by indicating that Martin Luther King admitted that he was a democratic socialist. So I tell people, if they are against Bernie Sanders, they're against Martin Luther King. And so I'm going to quote King from 1966. Quote, "You can't talk about solving the economic problem of the Negro without talking about billions of dollars. You can't talk about ending the slums without first saying profit must be taken out of slums. You're really tampering and getting on dangerous ground because you're messing with folk then. You're messing with the captains of industry. Now, this means that we are treading in difficult water because it really means that we're saying that something is wrong with capitalism. There must be a better distribution of wealth." This is King speaking. "And maybe America must move toward a democratic socialism." This was one of the few times that he mentioned this in a speech, but in private conversations, he mentioned it more often, knowing, as he said here, that, boy, you're upsetting the captains of industry. So Martin Luther King was a democratic socialist, which has much to do with the economic arrangements in society. And I actually believe that we are further away from that now than we were when he was assassinated. And so with that, I'll close. Thank you. So I'll stay a few minutes longer if you have some questions.